Welcome to Trending in Education. Mike Palmer here. Always extra excited when someone's back for their third appearance. We have Kate Eberle Walker back today. She's the CEO of Presence Learning, and she wrote a book that we talked about briefly last time she was on the show. It's called The Good Boss. We're going to dive into how to be a good boss, why she wrote the book, lots of really interesting stuff to dig into there. But before we do any of that, Kate, welcome back to Trending in Education.
Thank you for having me. I'm pretty excited to meet the triple guest mark here.
Yeah, I know. And there's a refrigerator magnet in this for you, as if you didn't have incentive enough.
I'm in it for the magnet.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Exactly. But you've also written a magnetic book, not literally magnetic, but there's a lot of interesting ideas in there. And we talked briefly about it the last go around, but maybe just a real short introduction of who you are in case folks aren't familiar with who you are. And then we can get into The Good Boss and what drove you to write it.
Sure. Yeah. So I'm currently CEO of Presence Learning, which is a teletherapy company. We provide therapy for special education programs for K through 12 schools. And I've worked in education a long time. Before Presence Learning, I was most recently CEO of the Princeton Review and tutor.com, which I've talked with you in the past about lots of interesting thoughts and directions about education and what's going on in our education community these days. And yeah, now I've written a book, which is out in the world too. It's called The Good Boss: 9 Ways Every Manager Can Support Women at Work. And it is informed by my own experiences now as a CEO and also reflecting on my path throughout my career upward through the corporate world.
Yeah, it's a great read. I just finished it. I definitely recommend it to our listeners. I have the 9 rules open in front of me. They're all really accessible. They're really interesting. I think we could go through them quickly. We'll zero in on a few of them along the way to go a little bit deeper. One of the things I will say that I really liked about the book is the fact that it's very accessible. It's as though you're having coffee with a friend and they're telling you stories about their life experience, their work experiences, and it is very much about growth and self-improvement as a professional and as a whole professional, not just as someone who's laser focused on work. And it also, I did really the fact that it maybe wasn't exclusively written for men, but it is a book that is very important for men to read because frequently when you talk about being a good manager for women, or you're talking about what it's like to rise as a woman through your professional life, at times I think men can tune those conversations out. And you seem to have very specifically focused on what it takes to be a good boss to women. And that message is in some ways as important to get out to men as it is to get to women.
Yeah, a lot of times people, men and women, do kind of default to the idea that when you talk about mentorship of women, management of women, that's for women to do. And it was true in a lot of cases in my own career. I really got set on my path to becoming a CEO when I went to work for a female CEO, and she mentored me. She saw me as her successor and developed me to get there. And that's true for a lot of women when they look back. You find these other women who become your mentors and your advocates. But I just kept running the math on that and recognizing there's not nearly enough women in positions of influence, power, CEO seats, board seats, to provide all of the mentorship and development that all of the younger women out there need. And I started thinking more about other bosses and mentors in my life and recognized a lot of them were men as well, who really did important things for me in my career, and started talking with other women. And it was true for them as well, that you have all kinds of good bosses, important bosses in your lives. Many of them are men. By the numbers of it, it's going to be that way. 2 out of 3 managers are men. I wanted to write something that got over that default assumption of, oh, this is advice for managing women, so it's for women to read. And so, I almost maybe go overboard at times in really being direct and clear, wanting to be clear about it. Men, this is for you too. And I think it takes that. There is that societal bias. Even still, when I talk about the book and tell male leaders about it, I do often get a first response of, oh, this is so great. I'm going to give it to my wife. I'm going to give it to my daughter. I'd love to have you come speak to our women's group at our company. But yeah, I'm pretty determined to surpass the bias and be like, that's great. I would love to talk to all of those people, but I also want you to read it.
Yeah. And in some ways, it's an even better book for the male managers in your life, at least from my perspective, because I think there's a lot to learn from. And the lessons learned frequently, as I mentioned when we were setting up, they're frequently cringeworthy. They're frequently, oops, somebody
Mhm.
did something they really shouldn't do. And it's many of these rules, I kind of wish Kate didn't have to write that down, but at the same time, you really did have to write these things down. So they may sound obvious, but especially when you flesh it out with some real personal experiences from you or lessons learned from other executives who you've interviewed throughout the book, and there's good statistics throughout the book too. So it seems to check all the boxes across those fronts. But the first rule is a good place to start, which is call her by her name. Again, sounds intuitive, but then
Mhm.
when you start peeling the layers back, you start realizing all the ways in which frequently it might be called a microaggression or just something subtle that quote unquote slips out that really doesn't show the level of respect and comfort with someone,
Mhm.
perhaps, that leaders frequently exhibit, maybe for male employees. Can you expand a bit on the call her by her name rule?
Yeah, it sounds so simple. It's get her name right, and that includes not using terms of endearment, not nicknaming her when she didn't introduce herself that way, saying it right, spelling it right, remembering if she gets married and changes her name or doesn't, calling her what she chooses to be called. This was such an interesting rule and chapter to write because it just kept getting longer. And what I thought was, okay, I'm going to start with the simple, like this will be a short one. I believe it's the longest chapter in the book because
Mm-hmm.
there was so much to say. There were women had so much to say. I mean, the stories that I tell from them about the experiences they have, there are so many moments and they happen every day. So
Right.
it's that feeling of it adds up. And it's distracting at best, I think infuriating at worst, when somebody calls you by the wrong name. And when you correct them and they do it again,
Right.
it creates this extra burden that women really feel because now, like their lack of listening skills or lack of attention paid to you in getting your name right now it's created this burden on you of, do I correct him a second time? Do I want to be that person? Should I just deal with it? And that kind of weight really can add up over the course of a career.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of cases where, to me, it's one of the easier things that a manager can do and get right. Pay attention to these things. I'm surprised in my own company and meetings in the everyday, I've become the name police and,
Yeah.
always jumping in and correcting when somebody says it wrong, spells it.
Yeah. And it's very topical. Dr. Jill
Joe
Biden,
Biden.
yeah,
Hmm.
was recently called out a bit by the Wall Street Journal, and then the Wall Street Journal got plenty of blowback for that conversation that was started. But there are a lot of, and you mentioned it, almost subtle digs that you may not want to make a big deal out of. And that was something else that it was great to get that window into your experiences where you're someone, you went to Harvard Business School, you understood negotiation and power moves as well as anyone,
Hmm.
but you also come across as someone who, at least earlier in your career, was a nice person. But you had to understand, do I just want to go along to get along? Or
Hmm.
do I want to make a point of this? And frequently, when you're just getting to know someone, is when the naming begins. And if you're not taking that first step and asserting yourself, frequently it is almost a power move, and you don't always know what's happening on the other side.
There's a lot of power dynamic at play here. When you introduce yourself and someone doesn't feed the same name back that you said, they weren't listening to you.
Mhm.
And people listen when they think someone's important. They're not going to get the name wrong of the president of the United States or
Right.
for the CEO in their company. I'm now on the comfortable side of it, and people don't get my name wrong. And it's partly me having that perspective now and recognizing it. Wait a second, like it's the same name that it always was. That's really interesting. I used to have to stop people all the time who I said, I'm Kate, and they said, nice to meet you, Katie. And
Right.
and I was like, it's not Katie, it's Kate. I didn't say Katie. And there's a signal there
Mhm.
that someone is telling you that they don't think you're that important when they don't listen well enough to get your name. And then you have to decide on your end of it, am I gonna call that out? Am I gonna make it uncomfortable? Am I gonna let it go? Suffer the consequence myself that I'm really annoyed right now at being called by a slightly wrong name.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And then just moving through the rules, there's be someone she can relate to. I think that one makes sense. That one's also interestingly tied to that's rule number 2, rule number 8, which is be an equal opportunity asshole. So
Hmm.
ideally you could be someone she relates to, but if you are gonna, be critical and tough, don't just be critical and tough to your male employees who can handle it.
Yep.
Be critical and tough to everyone. A lot to chew on there. Rule number 3, don't ask what your husband does, which is another one that I think maybe is a little bit cringeworthy. But getting to rule number 4, which is one I want to, as I know you have some interesting stories about this one, don't sit in her chair. Can you share the story? Because it's also interesting where you go into some of your personal experiences as a working mom and as someone who took maternity leave and then was coming back. Same thing with your name changing around that. It was nice that you covered that full span of your experiences from beginning early career right
Hmm.
on through coming back. But can you tell the story about not sitting in her chair?
Yes, sure. So this is something that happened to me when I was coming back to the office, my first day back after my first maternity leave. So I'd had my first daughter, took 3 months away from the office, and I was coming back. And I think for anyone who has gone through that process and has made the return to work, the first day back is really complicated, really emotional, really hard. It's very difficult to leave this baby for the first time, for a whole day, and it's just disorienting, honestly, to be back out in the world as a fully functioning adult, for the first time in a while. So it's one of those days that it's a really big deal, and I think and I say that to say it's really important and incumbent upon coworkers and your manager especially to be ready for that day, ready to welcome you back. So what happened to me on that first day, I came in, rode up in the elevator, got off, walked to my office, and there was literally somebody sitting in my chair. It was my Goldilocks and the Three Bears experience. One of my coworkers was sitting in my office and totally, working at the
Mhm.
desk. And we had this sort of awkward exchange. I was like, hi. And he's like, welcome back. And we chatted. And then there's a pause, and he's still sitting in my chair and I'm still standing there. And I think both of us are like, why are you not leaving? But I had to really get direct and finally say, so you're in my office and I am back. Can you get out of my chair? And we had a real argument about it. He
Mhm.
made me feel like I was being ridiculous and unreasonable. Like, geez, it's just an office. Why don't you go down the hall? My old office is there. I was really mad about it. I really dug in on it. My office it had the better window. I wanted
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
wanted that office. And I had to argue to get it back. And it just really set off this feeling of there are all kinds of metaphors. There's a lot of other ways where you come back and you've been displaced and other people have been doing pieces of your job, figuring out how to get by without you for several
Mhm.
months. And you're questioning all of this. Should I be here? Am I needed here? Is this the
Mhm.
right thing? And you've got this new pull of being needed at home, being needed
Mhm.
by your baby. And all of those dynamics get really difficult to manage when you just literally feel like there's no physical place for you. Someone has taken your chair and
Yeah.
there's nowhere for you to sit.
Yeah, and it's a pretty extreme example, but your point about the subtler aspects of this too is that frequently people will start to move on a bit. 3 months is a long time, and then trying to reassert yourself. It is a nice. I think the book works for a number of different audiences, but even stepping outside of the gendered look, the ways in which you do assert yourself throughout your career in the stories that you tell are good life lessons, I think, for any reader, where you demonstrate consistently, and I guess you've done this through your life, it's in your book,
Mm.
that you're not a pushover. You're
Yeah.
agreeable, but
Yeah.
you're agreeable to a point, and then there is like a hard backbone there that
That's
is,
right. That's
yeah,
right. It's
yeah.
important. It's connected to how I negotiated deals in all of the years that was my job. Yeah, I guess I've put a lot of thought into choosing when I'm going to be agreeable or when I need to hold a hard line and
Mhm.
stand up and say, no, that's not okay. It's got to be this.
In some ways, that's the bigger picture idea too, where ideally any manager would want to help someone grow and progress through their career in the way that you did. And a lot of that required your managers, your mentors to empathize with you And then
Hmm.
I think part of the lesson that I got from your book is that you were putting yourself out there so that we could understand better simple things that we might have missed
Yeah.
that actually make a huge impact on how someone feels about their potential for growth.
Exactly. And in that stealing of the office example, I shared that because I wanted to show that for me, it was a really hard moment that caused me to question, do I belong here? And
Hmm.
I think back and I think what a simple thing it would be for a manager to instead, the day before I came back, clear out my office, get it all ready,
Yeah.
be waiting and ready to welcome me back. And that doesn't take a lot of effort. It just takes a little thoughtfulness and recognition of what an important moment that is and what you can do to make sure that it goes smoothly. And because these are universal experiences, the other thing that I've learned in telling that story, which I thought, yeah, I was telling you, isn't this so crazy? Can you believe it? Most women that I share that with tell the same thing back. They're, oh, that happened to me too. Sometimes it's a chair was stolen or
Yeah.
a coat hook or a
Hmm.
stapler. It can vary what the thing was, but that feeling of coming back and people have taken over your space and your stuff is actually, it's pretty common.
Yeah. And unfortunately, toxic work cultures are also pretty common.
Hmm.
And that's another thing that I was reflecting on as I was reading is that a lot of the toxic cultures are led by men.
Yeah.
And there is work for us all to do to understand where that toxicity resides, and then also figuring out who can change their behavior and then who really just needs to get expulsed from the greater body to make the organization healthier. Do you have any perspective on that based on your experience? Like, it does feel like there's an interesting mix of good bosses, a blend of the middle, and then there's some folks. I get the impression like you've run into folks who are less redeemable in your career. Can you talk a bit about how you make those distinctions and how you navigate reaching out to try to help
Yeah.
versus maybe overextending yourself to someone who's not really going to be able to receive it?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest questions. And it's this relationship between you and your manager it is multifaceted and it's a very human relationship to me.
Hmm.
That's my approach. It's not just about the work you do, the work you're asked to do. There's so much more to it. And is this a person wwho believes in me, who
Hmm.
is supporting me, who's going to
Hmm.
advocate for me? And yeah, the times that I felt like I was working for someone who wasn't a good boss, it was that they were letting me down in those areas.
Yeah.
And that could be in the context of other things happening in a company and other elements of a toxic environment. But I think that it's not so much a whole company culture is thumbs up or thumbs down. It's about the personal experience that everyone has
Yeah.
inside that company. And that to me is largely steerable and driven by the manager. So
Yeah.
I look back and people ask me for advice about how do you know when you can improve a situation or when you should stick it out, so to
Yeah.
speak, or when it's time to move on. And to that I say, number one, you've really got to examine your relationship with your manager. Is this somebody who believes in me, who
Hmm.
cares about me, who is advocating for me, is going to bat? And I always suggest you might try asking for things directly. That's what I did. That's what I would do is if you feel like they're not advocating for you, ask them to.
Hmm.
If they still don't, then you've got to look for your workaround in a company. And I think that they're often there. You look to somebody who has more power than you, who's higher up than you, who you think probably does care, is
Yeah.
likely to care, and you go to them and you ask them to believe in you, care about you, help you figure out the solution. And I think that's how a lot of these solutions happen. I think some would call it a workaround. I don't know. I think it's finding those relationships
Yeah.
in a company and expecting of your manager that they're going to advocate for you. And if they don't, I think you look elsewhere in a company. And I do that. I would always do that before looking to leave a company,
Yeah.
because it's that just because an individual relationship with a manager isn't the right one doesn't mean that you're not going to find another great one there.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it does tie to the old adage people leave their bosses more than their
Yeah.
jobs. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah. So watch the clock. That one was interesting, just particularly in light of COVID. Can you
Mhm.
quickly hit on that one?
Yeah, I mean, this watch the clock is about really being aware of the time and the schedule constraints that women are balancing, particularly with work and home. And
Mhm.
I think that going into COVID, working moms especially were striking a tenuous balance already. You're keeping your schedule tight and you'd figure out, you put a lot of work into the schedule itself and making sure that you'd map things out that you could get your kids where they needed to go, that you could get somebody watching them, that you could get yourself to the meeting on time,
Mhm. Mhm.
leave on time. There's all of these sort of domino effect kind of factors. And if something fell out of place, it could really create a lot of stress or a lot of work to find a new solution. I
Yeah.
think when COVID happened, that knocked a lot of the dominoes over for a lot of women. There was all of a sudden a lot less access to childcare. There was a lot less childcare outside the home, school outside the home. But you were really confronted with the reality that, like, two big things, your job and your kids often needed you every hour.
Mhm.
And there was a lot of overlap and interaction. And I think we've all seen what's happened there and how many women have left the workforce, or in my own company, needed to reduce hours, change schedules, try a temporary leave to get things organized. And we've been trying so many different solutions, trying to figure out how to help women get through this past year. And I think it's all pointing to a big need for awareness and empathy and support
Mhm.
from employers and managers going forward. How do we come out of this? How do we help these women who did need to leave the workforce come back to doing the work that they want to do? And
Yeah.
I think that if I can find a silver lining in this year, it's that at least everyone is aware of it. Everyone's seen it now. You can't miss it when somebody's kids are running behind them on
Right.
the Zoom screen.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think there's more recognition when it comes to household management, childcare, and
Mhm.
that double shift that women experience. I think there's more recognition. We all need to keep on putting a lot of brain power into finding the right solutions.
Yeah. And I liked also where you signaled as a CEO, as a leader, when the holiday party was the same
Mhm.
day as your daughter's concert, you took that as an opportunity to let your team know who you are.
Yeah. And another thing that I think is really important that's true in life and therefore really important for leaders to talk about honestly is that you cannot do everything that you want to do and that people want you to do.
Mhm.
And yeah, I was faced with one of those examples. CEO of my company, we were a portfolio company of a larger business that, set the holidays at the big holiday party date that was all company event. And they set it for the exact same date and time as my daughter's school holiday concert. And I realized it and I was like, oh man, I can't not go to the company party, but I can't not go to this concert. And I weighed the two and I decided that I was going to go to my daughter's concert. That way, that they would miss me more and that
Mhm.
I would feel I was missing out more if I didn't attend what was every year really one of those really important moments with them, with the school community. So I wrote a letter to all my employees and I told them why I was missing the party and what for. And I was really surprised. I was a newer CEO then. It was one of, those earlier moments of starting to come into your own, of really just being honest about who you are.
Yeah.
And I was overwhelmed by the notes and conversations that came out of that from people, from men and women, who said that I've never had a CEO really acknowledge and say that it's okay
Mhm.
to miss something work related because of your family, that it's
Mhm.
okay to choose your family. And so it was really, I learned a lot from them and recognizing, okay, this is something that you need to not just do, but talk about how you're doing
Yes.
it.
Yeah. That's what struck me. If you didn't write the note, that
Hmm.
would have been a very different set of signals. And it is interesting throughout where you have to continue to rise to the challenge, even if the state of play changes as you advance
Yeah.
in your career. The one I wanted to spend another moment on too is rule 6, which is speak up so that she doesn't have to. Can you explain what that means?
Yeah, this really gets to, you call them cringy moments, but these uncomfortable moments that we all can't ignore, that they happen in the workplace. I mean, the Me Too movement unearthed a lot of them, but it still happens, and it happens in comments and conversations, and it can sometimes be micro moments or a sentence, the ways that people talk to women or about women in the workplace that women are confronted with. And I share a story at the beginning of this chapter about a time when I was much younger. I was out to a, fancy steak dinner after closing a deal, and the whole deal team had gone out. I was the only woman and the youngest, and really had no power in the situation. And one of the more senior men on the team started really focusing on me across the table, asking me all of these questions that were making me blush about my dating life and
Yeah.
what was I wearing. And it was super uncomfortable for me. I didn't really know how to handle it. I didn't feel comfortable. I didn't want to make it a thing or an issue. And this other man at the table, a very senior partner at the law firm we were working with, just really, it was so easy for him to do this. And he just very casually said to the other guy, as your lawyer, I recommend you not to say things like that. He laughed it off. Everyone laughed, and it just shut it down and moved on. And I look back on that and think that's the responsibility of people who have the power. It's
Mhm.
so much easier for you to interrupt, interject, stop things, move a conversation away, and not leave women to their own devices.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking a lot about this one. There's a news cycle now about Governor Cuomo and these women who have come forward with their stories. And I've been thinking about it again in this context of we put this tremendous burden on these women to be so brave and come forward and speak
Mhm.
up for themselves and tell these stories. What about everyone else who
Yep.
saw it happening and had more power than them? What could they have said? What could they have done to not leave these women, these young women especially, having to muster up all of the bravery themselves to speak up?
Yeah, yeah, it definitely gets the wheels turning, and it is on really on all of us, particularly those of us who may be more senior, further on in our careers, more in a position of influence to take on that responsibility, really to hold people in check. And I do like that you give different examples about doing it through humor, doing it in the moment versus following up after the moment, but not letting it go. And you talk about your regrets from your experience when you did
Mm-hmm.
let things happen that you could have done
Mm-hmm.
something more about. I like that you really flesh out these rules with your own experiences, some of which sounded difficult to navigate.
Yeah, and I mean the other thing that I really with this rule in particular did a lot of testing out the strategies and the ideas that I was recommending, not with CEOs, but with people in the middle or who had been in those early manager roles. Like maybe they're, not the most junior person anymore, but they're not the CEO. They
Hmm.
can't just come in and dominate the conversation. And I worked with readers, a lot of them were male middle managers, to help me really test out like, would this work? Would you really say this? What would
Hmm.
you do? And letting them call me out on, I think some of the earlier drafts of this I remember were a little too CEO-ish. And it was like,
Yeah.
well, you can say that, but
Hmm.
I wouldn't say that. And I put this chapter through the ringer of let me get to something that's actually useful
Yeah.
and practical for somebody to use as a guide.
Yeah, it reminded me of what I always wanted out of HR trainings, even though I knew they
Mm.
couldn't necessarily get as real life because they're constrained. But I felt like this was a little more of just an honest conversation about how to navigate in an ethical, professional way while repping for people who may need support. Rule number 7, don't make her ask twice. I think my wife may have informed me of this rule as well, but I realized that wasn't what it was
Different context.
intended for. But can you share what that one is?
This is really about negotiation, especially negotiation of compensation, really all elements of it. There's a lot of people who take the approach of you say no, and if somebody really wants it, they'll push you and they'll come ask again.
Hmm.
And you really set up a dynamic where people have to negotiate hard and self advocate.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of information, a lot of statistics out there that show that when you set women up to have to aggressively self advocate, it statistically does not go as well for them as it does for men
Hmm.
because there's this catch 22 and people don't actually like it when women ask for things aggressively and they'll penalize them for that or they'll ascribe negative personality traits to people, to women when they negotiate more aggressively. So it sets up this cycle that it's hard for women to break out of, where
Mhm.
you set them up so they have to ask, they have to advocate, but then when they do, you hold it against them. Really, I start with don't make her ask twice. Give her a straight answer, yes,
Yeah.
no, or what do we need to do to make it yes the first time she asks, understanding that it took more for her to get to that ask than it would for a man on average.
Mhm.
But I actually end that chapter with saying, you know what? Better yet, don't make her ask at all. Be proactive. I especially believe this in the context of compensation and making job offers. Offer the right amount for what the role is worth. Don't
Mhm.
do that thing of, I'm going to offer the low end of a range and leave
Yes.
room. Like when I'm making an offer, I'm very upfront about, yeah, I don't believe in
Right.
negotiation. Here's why. And
Mhm.
therefore, I've been thoughtful about what's the full fair value. And this is what it is. And we can talk it through. I'm not setting it up. And in fact, I'm not holding back money for you to ask for. And I try to take the negotiation element out where I can, because I know that it doesn't set up women to succeed.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm ready for your next book on negotiation tactics too, because it permeates this book in a very human, authentic way. Be an equal opportunity asshole. I love the title. We'll put the explicit E on this episode. But we talked a bit about it as ideally you want to be someone who they can relate to, but we all have our own styles.
Yeah.
And part of that style is sometimes coming across as the tough, firm, but fair. But can you flesh out being an equal opportunity asshole?
Yeah, it's really about what it's about. There's always value in directness and honesty and telling people what you really think of their work, even if it's negative feedback, not positive feedback. And the worst thing that you can feel as a woman is that someone's going easy on you. And I've had both of these experiences. I've worked for some really tough bosses who were extremely challenging and maybe a little rough around the edges about it, but I loved working for them. And they pushed me a lot further in my career because they thought I could do better. They pushed me to do more, and I could rise to the occasion just like the men. They
Mhm.
talked to me the same way. And I felt like I was an equal. I felt like it actually earned me more respect from the other men, my other
Mhm.
colleagues, to see that I was being pushed that way, challenged that way, and could answer to it just like them.
Mhm.
Whereas I've been in other situations where I think of it as like misguided chivalry. Like
Mhm.
people get a little nervous. They give softer feedback. They don't want to be too harsh, so to speak. And that's not a good feeling as a woman in the workplace, either if you feel like someone's going easy on you, like they think you're going to cry. So, yeah, so that's what this rule is about is look, if you dish it out, just do it to everybody. That's better. It's not, I'm not encouraging everybody to be rough on people all the time, but
Right.
I'm giving a little asterisk to that and saying, but if you are, if that's who you are, because this whole book is about authentic management and
Mhm.
bringing your whole person into it. If that's the kind of person you are, just be that to everyone.
Right.
That's better and more equalizing than treating people differently.
Yeah, and even deal with the discomfort you might have of a crying employee at times is
Yeah.
another thing
Some
that
great pointers in there
yeah.
from other managers about what to do, what not to do when someone cries, because that does happen. And biologically, we women are more inclined to cry.
Yeah. And it's and
I've
you
cried at work. I've
yeah.
cried at work for sure.
Yeah. And you still have to work. You still have to do the stuff, and then also understand that frequently, if someone is crying, they feel much more uncomfortable than you do, and it does come back to the importance of empathy and trying to understand what it might feel
Hmm.
like to be on the other side of this dynamic. And then the last one in terms of the rules is rule number 9, which is tell her that you see her potential. And this is the flip side of the tough love. It's also show her you see her potential, but also be smart about how you're giving her compliments and how you're seeing her
Hmm.
upside. Can you round that one out a bit?
Yeah, it's part of it is again just that not just honesty, imagination, like envision a bigger path for her, talk to her about it, say it out loud. That's something. There are gaps in how women think their managers perceive them.
Mm,
And I talk about here and throughout the book, there's this kind of what I think is a myth of this confidence gap, that women aren't confident enough. And if you just had more confidence in yourself, you'd be successful. What I say and what I think is that it's really more that we're as managers not giving them reason to be confident that we think they're great, and just tell them directly what they're doing, what you see them becoming, what role is next for them, and engage them in that conversation, again inviting them to that conversation instead of setting them up for where they have to self-advocate. So it's that, and then it's also about how you do that. What are the compliments, and making sure that they are truly genuinely, you're identifying her strengths and pushing her to bring out her strengths even more, and not complimenting, of course, again, these things that you think you don't have to say anymore, but I do think you have to say. That means don't compliment her physical appearance, compliment her intellect, please.
Yeah, right.
And that stuff still, I think I gave an example in the book of, that's not from that long ago, when I was, asked to join like a panel at a conference, and walk up, and one of the men on the panel, a fellow CEO, is, this panel got a whole lot better looking. And like, what about like this? This panel got a whole lot smarter. Like, that's what we want to hear as women in the workplace.
Yeah, exactly. And then even as we're getting towards wrapping up here too, like, you're someone who people took a chance on as well. So not just seeing the potential, but giving a woman in your organization, giving someone who has a different profile than the majority of people in the room a chance.
Yeah. One of the CEOs that I interviewed in the book, Sam Yegan, he's been CEO, founder of a lot of things, but currently ShopRunner. He talks about how he loves to create roles that are designed to give someone the chance to show their potential. He's a big fan of making up jobs. What he meant by that was, if you see someone and you see this talent and these skills, instead of trying to fit them into a pre-existing path, to say, I'm going to create this job where you're going to do these 4 things because you're going to be amazing at them. And you create that environment and that role in which someone can really stand out and shine and have an impact. And so I loved that idea of adapting the jobs themselves to be fit to showcase the talents of the people who work for you.
Yeah, quite a bit to chew on. There's 9 rules. It's a quick read. There's a lot of really engaging stuff in here. It's called The Good Boss. Kate, as we're wrapping up, any concluding thoughts to bring this whole thing home?
I said it at the beginning, and as I say, it's always worth repeating. My hope is that every manager, women and men included, will read the book and just really engage in this idea that it's not women's work to support women in the workplace. It's all of our jobs. And I'm thankful for everybody who gives the book a read and engages on supporting women.
Excellent. Kate Eberle Walker is the CEO of Presence Learning. She's the author of The Good Boss. Lots for us to chew on. It's a trend to keep an eye on. If you're not a good boss, increasingly, you may no longer be a boss. So there's plenty to learn about and to grow from this book. Kate, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And for our listeners, if you like what you're hearing, tell a friend, write us a review, share the love. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.